A couple weeks ago, Microsoft settled on a deal to acquire Activision Blizzard for a whopping $68.7 billion. This is the largest acquisition in the history of video games, both in terms of monetary value and in overall popularity of the acquired intellectual properties, and it's by a staggeringly huge margin. The second most expensive acquisition in the video games industry is Take-Two's purchase of Zynga for $12.7 billion, which happened just a week earlier than Microsoft getting ActiBliz. If you add their Bethesda acquisition on top of this, it means Microsoft spent a massive $76.8 billion on acquisitions in the last year. They now have the potential to perform a chokehold of exclusivity on franchises like Doom, Fallout, The Elder Scrolls, Quake, Wolfenstein, Dishonored, Prey, Call of Duty, Warcraft, StarCraft, Overwatch, Hearthstone, Diablo, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, Crash Bandicoot, Spyro, and more, entirely at their own behest. They've been diplomatic enough to state that some of these properties will still show up on PlayStation from time to time, and they'll still commit to any sort of contractual obligations Activision made with Sony before the acquisition. But regardless, these are massive gets for Microsoft. To put it into perspective, Activision Blizzard is so huge in terms of employee count that as soon as the papers were signed, the vast majority of Xbox Game Studios employees were then Activision employees. Matter of fact, Blizzard by itself has more employees than all of the original Xbox Game Studios and Bethesda lineup put together. Why do these studios have so many employees? Well, probably due to the fact that so many of their games require constant upkeep, updates, and maintenance due to their online nature, in addition to having multiple teams to work on other projects. Either way, it's now a bit easier to understand why this is such a massive acquisition. Considering how industry-changing this one transaction could be, it's inspired a lot of questions and head-scratches as to how all of this stuff works. Some people wonder, how is the cost of the company being acquired determined? Microsoft spent $68.7 billion on ActiBliz, but how did they land on that number? Some people already know the answer to this, but I'll give an explanation for those who don't. Simply put, the cost of a company being acquired is determined by their market cap, which is the total value of all the company's outstanding market shares. That's it. For example, if a company has 10 million shares worth $20 each, then their market cap is $200 million, which would be the bare minimum another company would need to spend in order to acquire them. Easy. But generally, the purchasing company needs to spend a certain percentage more than market cap if they evaluate that the acquired company is really worth it. As of writing the script to this video, Activision Blizzard's market cap is $61.6 billion. So Microsoft paid a fairly generous amount more than market cap, because they believe it to be a worthwhile purchase. Simple as that. The follow-up question is, how is the purchasing company's spending money determined? How does Microsoft pay that $68.7 billion? Well, typically when a company acquires another, it's covered by a combination of cash and shares. But even if this acquisition were cash only, Microsoft could still afford it, because they reportedly had about $135 billion cash on hand when the acquisition happened. Yeah, Microsoft is insanely loaded, if that wasn't obvious enough. Now, with that little detour out of the way, along with the acquisition comes a lot of concerns from the consumers. It's only natural for people who aren't fanboys with raging console war boners to be worried at the idea of Microsoft owning so many high-profile intellectual properties. For example, they now practically have an undisputed iron grip around the first-person shooter genre, owning the likes of Halo, Call of Duty, Doom, Quake, Wolfenstein, Overwatch, Fallout, and Dishonored. Two of which are known for both strong campaigns and investing multiplayer, one of which also has a Battle Royale spin-off. 3 of them are legendary arena shooters, 1 is a competitive hero shooter, 1 is an RPG, and the last is an immersive sim. As far as anyone is concerned, no other company stands a chance at competing against Microsoft in shooters. They unquestionably dominate the genre now, and I still haven't even mentioned secondary franchises like Prey, Rage, or older franchises that can return like Heretic and Hexen, and any one-off games they might produce. Microsoft now owns all of these, and frankly, as much as I dislike this on a personal level, it could be an amazing business decision for them in the long run, assuming they know how to take advantage of this borderline genre monopoly, because first-person shooters is a very diverse sphere that can draw in all different types of people, and they own enough IPs to cover many bases. But still, is the normal, smart consumer really all that eager to see one platform holder totally rule over one genre? I don't think so. A ton of money is being thrown around in the industry lately, and with Microsoft being a major platform holder with the Xbox and Game Pass, a lot of people can't help but wonder how competitors will respond or stay competitive, namely Sony. The PlayStation has always been the closest rival to the Xbox brand, and since Microsoft has been swooping up these big companies, a lot of folks have been wondering about Sony's response to it all. But whether people were ready for it or not, Sony did snap up a big studio of their own only 2 weeks later. Bungie, the current developers of Destiny and original creators of Microsoft's #1 IP, Halo, for $3.6 billion, which is a real neck-breaker of a twist of fate. I'm not suggesting that this acquisition actually is a response to Microsoft obtaining ActiBliz, because these things typically take months to organize until they culminate into a real paper signing. So, assuming that this acquisition is a response to anything, as opposed to a consideration they might have already had for months or even years, it would be a response to Microsoft getting Bethesda, but again, it's probably not a response at all. Obviously, Sony snatching up Bungie is nowhere close to the level of Microsoft getting ActiBliz, as Bungie is currently only tied to one active franchise, Destiny. It's their baby, their lifeblood, and the only franchise they've been working on for the last 8 years. In fact, according to the stipulations in the acquisition, Bungie still retains self-publishing rights to their games, meaning any future titles might be multi-platform. Some might not be able to help but wonder what Sony gets out of a deal like this, but Jim Ryan's explanation makes things pretty apparent. Sony wants big, multi-platform live service games. They want to utilize Bungie's expertise to make games that as many people as possible can play, so they can have a constant revenue stream coming in from 1 or 2 IPs. Maybe more if they're unafraid of looming oversaturation, which they might be considering they expect to have 10 live service games come out by 2026, which could be way too goddamn many if they are similar in nature. It's not a very surprising strategy. Every publisher wants something like this. For example, consider how many projects the success of Final Fantasy XIV might have directly paid for within Square Enix's halls. But a flourishing live service game isn't easy to achieve. While Destiny has been a noteworthy example of it, there have been way more failures. Godfall, Anthem, Avengers, and then you have other games that aren't necessarily failures, but they don't come close to reaching Destiny's heights, like The Division and Warframe. Sony's acquirement of Bungie is not a grab for more exclusives, but more of an experiment to see if they can establish a large, passive revenue in the form of constantly updating live service games. The greatest fear that is linked to the idea of these constant big acquisitions is consolidation, which is further broken down into 2 parts. The first and foremost immediate worry the average consumer may have is the idea that platform holders owning larger and larger slices of the industry means owning multiple consoles will truly be required to experience all the big titles. Whereas normally, you could safely pick one console, stick with it for the whole generation, and only miss out on a few big exclusives on other platforms. It would be a bit unfortunate, but it was ultimately fine. Obviously, exclusives aren't a new concept. They are a side effect of a competitive market, where companies realize that if they need to stay afloat, they have to offer something their rivals don't have. However, these big acquisitions are going to make each platform's exclusivity pool much, much bigger by absorbing properties that were once multi-platform, thus making the ownership of multiple consoles more necessary for players who are fans of certain franchises. If your favorites are God of War, Elder Scrolls, Call of Duty, and Spider-Man, then you only needed a PlayStation to have all of those. But from now on, not so much. It's easy to say that you can still stick to one console and not sweat over a few you can't play. But the problem arises when that few turns into several and then turns into dozens, at the expense of them no longer being available on the console you actually bought. The second but more industry-focused part is the potential for uniformity or homogeneity that might spring up as a result of this consolidation. No one likes the idea of a gaming oligopoly where the entire industry is at the mercy of only a handful of corporate giants. In the worst case, all of these properties that have been given over to Microsoft might slowly become more and more similar to one another, either in gameplay mechanics or, more likely, monetization methods. It's not all that improbable. You need only to glance over at Ubisoft to see how this could happen. Think of all the ways that Assassin's Creed, Watch Dogs, and Far Cry are similar in gameplay, and how basically all of their franchises are similar in monetization. And they're nowhere near as big as Microsoft, who owns so many big IPs now, that finding alternative but identical, independent IPs with a similar level of quality for all of them is going to be even more difficult. No one wants a future where it's impossible to avoid companies you don't like, because they own everything. The true nightmare, however unlikely it may be, is Amazon and Google deciding to suddenly jump into gaming with their own machines and just start snatching up whatever remains of the indie scene. No matter where you turn, you would never be able to avert giving money to these big corporations. That would be awful. A corporate hellhole. There's other secondary worries to Microsoft getting Activision Blizzard, such as them wanting to bolster the value of Game Pass to the point where selling a physical machine is just a side hustle for them. And the reason why this is scary to some people is because of the towering implication that actually owning your games is something that's going to be a thing of the past. What if every platform holder manages to stay afloat as is, but now they only offer games via a monthly subscription where access to those games are taken away once the subscription ends? Even worse, what if it evolves, or devolves, into every publisher eventually needing their own subscription? Not a very alluring future for a lot of people. You could say Netflix and Spotify found success with these models just fine, but movies and music aren't video games, which are bigger pieces of media and require constant, direct interactivity to be enjoyed. In some cases, they encourage you to return at regular intervals or outright try to chain you down for daily activity. And then you have the other big elephant in the room, Bobby Kotick, the man in the big chair at the top of Activision Blizzard. He's received no punishment whatsoever for his blatant mishandling of basically every major controversy tied to the company. And while he does plan to exit once Microsoft gains full control, he's going to depart with a massive paycheck and live the rest of his days in luxury. Some people may think it's a victory to get him shoved off his big chair, and maybe it is to an extent. But he's going to fall gently with a golden parachute and land in a massive swimming pool of cash, Scrooge McDuck style. The only real comeuppance the man will receive is the likelihood that he's simply not getting as much exit money as he might have wanted. That's it. It's not surprising, but it's still very disappointing. However, it is a good thing that Activision Blizzard employees are now going to be given the opportunity to work in a much better environment. But, towering threat of intrusive industry oligopoly aside, I'm not trying to insist that there's literally no possible benefit to anybody here, no matter how small, because there is. With the purchase of Activision Blizzard, Microsoft gets a ton of IPs, yes, but that also includes other older ones that could see a revival. I mentioned Hexen and Heretic earlier, but there's also Guitar Hero and DJ Hero, Prototype, Gun, and others that deserve a return. If Microsoft makes the decision to put effort into giving these franchises some love instead of having a laser focus on only the big names, it could show their seriousness in trying to offer a wider variety of quality games, as opposed to simply wanting to squeeze every last penny out of every big name that's already being monetized to hell. Granted, this doesn't change the fact that this acquisition has happened, and it still doesn't close the door to a worrying amount of consolidation, but hey, it's a nice little butterfly band-aid on the wound. Before I close out, there's a couple other things to touch on in relation to this topic. First is PlayStation's promise that they'll be acquiring more studios. It begs the question of who they're eyeing. When Microsoft's acquisition of Activision Blizzard was first announced, there was a massive amount of speculation on whether Sony would buy up a company with just as many big IPs, like Square Enix, Sega, or Capcom. If we were to go by their market caps, Sony could sincerely afford at least one of them, possibly even two. Honestly, it makes Bungie's $3.6 billion price tag look like a hilarious ripoff due to them only having one active IP to their name in comparison to these other big publishers of equal cost. But here's the thing. Japan's acquisition and antitrust laws are much stricter than America's, which I'm glad for. That's honestly why it's easier to snap up American or European studios than it is Japanese ones. In fact, these acquisition laws are why Japanese companies prefer mergers instead, like Square and Enix, Bandai and Namco, Koei and Tecmo, etc. The amount of hoops Sony would need to jump through and red tape they would need to cross in order to buy these companies is almost certainly not worth the time. So if Sony is going to acquire more studios, I imagine they'll be Western. I assume Ember Labs is a candidate considering Kena Bridge of Spirits was a success. Maybe Lucid is another possibility considering Destruction All-Stars and recent rumors and speculation that they might be working on a MotorStorm revival. Nothing is confirmed, so do not take my word for it though. I'm not an insider or anything, I'm just repeating what I've read. That's all. Second, some people might wonder who is approaching their growth in a healthier manner, Microsoft or Sony. Is there someone worth rooting for here? Well, to be honest, I don't like acquisitions happening either way because there's always the risk of the acquired studio meeting an abrupt or downright sad and disrespectful fate as a result of their parent company's bad management. Even if the studio was once independent and had to scrape for resources, they're always in danger of meeting a bad end. And their IPs go unused for years on top of that. But if you put a gun to my head and forced me to favor one or the other, I guess I would tolerate Sony's approach a bit more, because they seem to be cultivating a relationship with studios, often smaller ones, before snatching them up. And it seems at least a bit more natural than Microsoft simply buying up a massive chunk of the industry overnight. This is basically everything I have to say on the topic of the acquisition wars. But it seems that more will happen as the months pass, so I can't rule out the possibility of another future video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.